I'm happy to introduce today Brian Olson, a former member of this office from a few years ago, who's been doing computer science for many, many years and also been interested in applying computer science to politics. So he's here today to talk about his thoughts on that, using computer science to get better democracy. So please welcome Brian Olson.
Thank you. So if you've ever had the feeling that our democracy is not entirely fair and sometimes the deck is stacked, you're right. In a lot of places, we have democracy that has been distorted by the state legislature using their power to make sure that their favorite candidate wins. In Florida in 2010, they passed by ballot initiative a new law to prevent that from happening, but it didn't work. This map that the Florida state legislature drew was later thrown out by court decision. So that's what we call gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the distortion of districts, representational districts, towards some political end. How does it work? So let's say you've got this hypothetical map that has a 60-40 split in its population favoring the green people. Now, if you cut that up in a very simple way, you get 3 districts that the green people win and 2 districts that the purple people win, preserving that ratio. If you cut it differently and you pack enough green people into just a couple districts, you can get 3 districts where the purple minority wins, thus inverting and letting the minority power have the majority power in that 5-person state legislature. Or if you do it the other way and you split the purple people just right, they don't get a majority anywhere and they're completely shut out. These strategies of packing and cracking have been used in many places around our country. In Florida, this district was found to be illegally packing too many people of an underrepresented group into one district so that they would have less influence elsewhere. Florida was doing that in 2012. But this is gerrymandering from 1812 here in Massachusetts, where the term was invented. Governor Elbridge Gerry signed into a law this map that was drawn into political cartoon as this monstrous dragonous salamander, thus coining the gerrymander. It's gotten a lot worse lately because computers have allowed people to draw lines very finely, looking at all the demographics down to little pockets of 100 people here and there, and thus making designer districts just for their particular purpose. But what if we use that same computational power to make completely impartial districts that just tried to make local representation without any political bias? You might get something like this. This is a map that I made with my open source software. We started to be able to make this kind of map about 10 years ago when home computers got fast enough to do this. So following the 2010 census, I downloaded all of the data, ran my home computer for 6 months, and generated 137 maps for all the states and state legislatures, except for a few where there were bugs I'm still working on. This is North Carolina. North Carolina has been in a constitutional crisis for years now over their gerrymandering. They have had 3 years in a row their maps thrown out by court, and they had to go back and fix them. I forget which generation of the map is. This is probably the map from 2013. You can see this big red district reaching into and around 3 other districts around it. This pink district pinches down as narrow as possible while reaching out to grab other areas. This is nuts. And the court has found that this is nuts and illegal and trying to distort the system. It could be like this, though. You can go from the hallmarks of gerrymandering, all of these fiddly bits reaching into and around everything, to soap bubbles. Maryland also has one of the most distorted, contorted district mappings I've ever seen. This is a Democratic Party gerrymander based on the Maryland state legislature's Democratic majority. The previous 2 were Republican gerrymanders. Maryland's Republican governor made some news briefly calling out for help, can somebody please help fix my state? To which President Obama said, yeah, we should fix gerrymandering. Everywhere, please. It could be like this. So my point about gerrymandering is that there is technology possible. There is political will on both sides of the aisle in various places to want to make a saner system. So let's do it. So how did I do it? I wrote effectively a custom GIS stack, Geographic Information Systems. It was a lot of code in various tools, depending on what part I was going to do. But it's pretty efficient. It runs on home computers. It's open source. You can all go look at it, but you probably wouldn't want to. It's not very pretty code. But I'm working on that. And I'm going to update it again for the 2020 cycle. It does the kind of data pre-processing stuff you'd expect, because it downloads raw census data, turns it into just the data needed to do redistricting, solves that. It can run in a distributed fashion on as many computers as you throw at it, and then finally rendering the map output. What data do you actually need to run this? The census data provides blocks as the lowest level of information they have. Sometimes literally a city block, sometimes just miles and miles and acres of land in Montana between this stream and that stream. But blocks that are split up based on some political or physical boundary, and the whole country is split up into about 9.5 million blocks of data. Some blocks have just 100 people or 0 people. Some blocks have 1,000 people. Each of those blocks has a position. It has its neighbors, because districts have to be contiguous. They can't have part of a district here and part of a district here with nothing in between. Although sometimes a gerrymandered district will have a town over here, a town over here, and a thin strip of road in between. Land area and information. So my process takes the raw census data down to from 2.5 gigabytes of raw data down to about 16 megabytes for a typical state of what I actually need to solve this problem. Makes it much more tractable. So what I'm actually solving for in my definition of compactness is the average distance per person to the center of their district. If this little map is a district, and those are blocks with population counts in them, I find the center of the district and then measure the distance to all of those blocks and weight it by the population. And minimizing for that score is how I identify a locality. A locality will be a relatively high density population area surrounded by a more sparse area around it in a typical town-city arrangement. And that's all I'm optimizing for. Just compact localities and no political or demographic information. You can look at the demographic information, though. The census provides lots of race and income-based demographics. And one of the big questions is, the Voting Rights Act used to specify that there would be a certain kind of gerrymandering for good. There shall be, in certain states, a majority-minority district to make sure you get a black congressman from Georgia, for example. And my system does not try to make those, but in a few states it winds up with them anyway, just because of where people are kind of self-sorting into where they choose to live. So that's still an open question about how we do this, though. The details are it's a heuristic hill climbing search. I can talk to you more about that if you're really curious. This is one run through the data of getting a little bit better as it's searching for a better solution. So that's the short version of gerrymandering and what you can do to make an impartial map. There's one other big fix that I'd like to see in our system, and that is when we actually go to vote for people, we can do better. You should never, ever again, if at all possible, pick just one person on a ballot. You all know the problem of being told, oh, don't vote for them, you're throwing your vote away. It's a two-party system, you have to vote for one of us. But we can do better. Once upon a time, a mathematician proved that if you only have one choice, that's only enough information to pick between two choices. If you only get to mark one person on your ballot, it will devolve to a two-party system. So let's do better. Let's rank our choices, first, second, third, and so on, or rate them on some on some scale, like a 5-star scale, or A through F letter grading, or -10 to 10, or even just approve, disapprove on each candidate gives you better results than picking one. But this is just data. If you can say something about every candidate, you're not throwing your vote away. You have said something about every candidate. You said, yes, I like this one, and this one's okay, and that one, no, not them. And if you don't get your favorite, you might get your second favorite. So you can vote for the weird, obscure, idealistic candidate who just really gets you moving, and then you can have your second choice, yeah, popular, mediocre, whatever. And then if it's just not your year and you don't get any of them, you can keep ranking your vote on down, and maybe you can help the other party elect a moderate instead of their crazy person. So ranked choice voting is good. But there are many algorithms to count these ballots, and they all have trade-offs. There was a famous theorem that proved you can't have a perfect system based on some set of qualities that all sound good, and it was proven you can't have all of those qualities at the same time. But you can still have a pretty good system. You can still have a better system and maybe a best system, and our current system is the worst system, aside from actual tyranny. So here's one algorithm, instant runoff voting. So you have a rankings ballot. You count up all the first choice votes. If someone has a simple majority, great, they win. Otherwise, whoever has the fewest first choice votes, you disqualify them, and all of those ballots, well, let's count their second choice vote now. And this repeats, disqualifying until finally somebody wins. Very simple system. It was used in Burlington, Vermont for a couple mayoral elections. And after you filter out the lesser candidates, here's the dramatic finish of that election, where people are getting disqualified one by one, and then finally you have a winner. One thing you can see about this is the vote counts for the eventual winners keep going up. As Dan Smith's candidates' votes are disqualified, well, they had a second choice of one of the other candidates, so those counts go up. As Andy Montrol is disqualified, the other counts go up as those votes are transferred. Another algorithm, Condorcet method, or Condorcet, a French mathematician from 100 years ago. I like to think of this as a virtual round-robin tournament, where the match score between each candidate is how many people like A higher than B versus how many people like B higher than A. And that's the score of them. And if more people like A higher than B than like B more than A, then A should win. A has defeated B. A ranked vote says, I like A higher than B, and A higher than C, and A higher than D. And I also like B higher than C. So you have information about all of these hypothetical pairings, and you can count it up, and the result looks something like this. This count says that from the same Burlington, Vermont election data, they published the full anonymized vote set, which is really useful for research like this. This count says that 4,067 people liked Andy Montrol better than Bob Kiss, and 3,477 people liked Bob Kiss better than Andy Montrol, and 4,500 people liked Andy more than Kurt or Dan. This is different. This is a different outcome than the instant runoff voting election. This is saying more people liked Andy Montrol than Bob Kiss or Kurt Wright, but the previous election was that Bob Kiss wound up winning. How did this happen? Andy Montrol had huge support at the second choice level. Kurt Wright and Bob Kiss had, really fanatic fans, but not so many of them in the end. So, Andy Montrol might have been this kind of centrist candidate that made a lot of people pretty happy. But he wasn't the first choice, and instant runoff voting only looks at the first choice, whereas a Condorcet virtual round-robin election looks at all of the data at once. So just from a perspective of navigating the solution space, Condorcet is a better algorithm. And it requires exactly the same inputs, a rankings ballot, first, second, third, and so on. Instant runoff voting was used in Burlington, Vermont twice, and then repealed, because they wound up really not liking the guy it elected on the second try. And they could have had a different outcome. The algorithm matters. In this age of search engines and news feeds, the algorithm matters. You have a big pile of data, but then what do you actually do with it? And one more kind of thing out there is that if you're picking more than one person, there's an even more powerful thing you can do. Proportional representation is the notion that if you're electing a city council or a state legislature, if 20% of the people show up in some constituency and vote for, I don't know, whatever their favorite cause is, then 20% of the seats of the legislature should go to that 20% group of people. That's proportional representation. And there's an algorithm called single transferable vote, which is used to achieve just that in the Cambridge City Council and a few parliaments around the world, like the Irish Senate, and they're trying it out in Australia. And I think this is a really powerful hack on democracy, because what if you had a state legislature that was not, if it was 40 people and it wasn't 21 Democrats and 19 Republicans, it was 13 Democrats, 12 Republicans, 5 Greens, 3 Libertarians, and I don't know, that guy. That would be a much more interesting and vibrant and representative democracy. This is about representing us. All of this is about representing us, whether we are people who live in an area and might have common concerns, like you live near Boston, you probably want the T to run, or you live near Amherst, you want, well, I don't know what they want in Amherst, and that's part of the problem. Or you can have the ideological representation of a proportional representation system where you get together and say, we all really care about preserving our parks and open spaces and green spaces. And if 10% of the people show up and vote for that, then they are going to get a couple seats that are just really going to push for that and introduce new legislation around that and build coalitions around that. So these are what I think are the most important hacks that we can do to improve our continuing democratic experiment. Thank you. Questions?
I was just curious what your thoughts were on approval voting, where you choose which candidates you like and which you don't like, and then whoever gets the most acceptance wins, which is a little simpler than some of the other systems, but still usually gives pretty good results from what I've seen.
Yes, it is definitely simpler. It definitely gives pretty good results. Another thing I've done that I didn't show here is run simulations on millions of simulated voters. It's a model. It's maybe not the best model, but it shows that, yes, approval is pretty good. I just find it unsatisfying, personally. I want to say, I like this guy better than this guy. And so I would prefer a rankings or a ratings ballot. But yes, approval is pretty good. And if it's the matter of, if you're just designing a survey form, if you can just switch from radio buttons to checkboxes, that's all you need to do to get better data.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that I'm on the board of an organization called Voter Choice Massachusetts, where we're advancing ranked choice voting here in Massachusetts, and I have a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to sign up. We have legislation and other things. I do want to respond a little bit to the criticism of the instant runoff algorithm. You bring up Burlington, and Burlington's not the only city that's used it. Currently, 11 cities in the United States use that form of ranked choice voting. And there's been over 150 elections since 2004 using that version. The Burlington 2009 election is the only one where the instant runoff result has differed from the Condorcet result. Mm-hmm. So it, in practice, seems to be a very, very rare outcome. So that's one comment I wanted to make. And the other thing is that I'm a little bit concerned with the Condorcet algorithm about some of the strategic manipulations that it is vulnerable to. For example, two frontrunners, if you insincerely rank your formidable opponent last, that can benefit you. Or bullet voting your first choice and not deciding to rank. The rest of the choices can benefit that first choice, can benefit that favorite candidate. And those are certain strategic vulnerabilities that the instant runoff version is immune to. And I think that's part of the reason it's been successful in being implemented across the country. And most recently, Maine became the first state in the nation to enact it, first state in the nation to enact it for statewide offices. So that's my commentary on those.
Yeah. I look forward to the Maine experiment. I wish them well. I hope they release full data so that we can analyze it properly. And yes, it's true that most of the time, instant runoff voting and Condorcet agree. My argument is that for no additional cost, you can get a better choice when they don't agree. The strategic concerns, there's what is sometimes called the favorite betrayal problem of, you have your favorite, and so you really want them to win, so you vote for them first. And then you vote for your second favorite, but if it hadn't been for that vote for that second favorite, your favorite would have won. And instant runoff voting doesn't do that because it doesn't look at your second favorite. But I think that's a flawed analysis because it's not just all about you. It's also about what can we all agree on. Your second choice is also pretty good, I hope. And so, if you say, well, this is pretty good, and it makes the rest of the group also happy, that should be an okay outcome. And if you are voting dishonestly and saying, yes, I want Hillary first and Bernie last, then you are shooting yourself in the foot. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Please just vote honestly and say, I like Hillary first and Bernie second, or I like Bernie first and Hillary second, or I like Winona LaDuke first and whatever else, and then Hillary and then Bernie. Just vote honestly, and if we implement a good system, it will do the right thing with that honest vote. So that's what I would say is, vote honestly. If you don't get your first choice, you might get your second choice, and that should still be pretty good.
I have a question about policy. I forgot about Maine, and I'm really excited that Maine is moving to ranked choice voting. But in general, with both gerrymandering and things like ranked choice voting, I sort of noticed that generally the people in charge of making the change to better systems are the people in power who probably stand to benefit the least, right? If you want to keep control of a two-party system because it works fairly well for you and it works fairly well for Democrats and Republicans, you probably aren't excited to hear about these exciting new plans to help get third-party candidates or vote for multiple candidates rather than being forced to pick between the two major parties. So I was wondering if you could speak to, in spite of that, what I perceive as an obstacle, like what people can do to sort of keep this conversation going and keep progress growing.
Right. Getting it through the traditional legislative process is right. There is an obvious conflict of interest between people who won via the old system versus enacting a new system. And so I believe that most of the time it gets in via ballot initiative. Direct democracy, people put something on the ballot, they vote it, it becomes law. That's what happened in Maine and several other places. Even the Burlington City Council, the Burlington mayor election was something that was voted on, a proposition that was locally voted on directly by the people, in and out.
Yes, this is kind of a similar comment or question, but with gerrymandering in particular, I think, as he mentioned, there's a lot of incentive for people to keep doing it. And I can see, relinquishing all the control to a computer might be hard, or an algorithm. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on proposals of just limiting the amount of damage that gerrymandering can do. Like one thing that I've seen or suggested is you've got n districts, you can draw n-1 straight line segments on the map, right? Or some other, because like right now, like you say, there's just contiguousness of a space, but you could have some aspect ratio or something like that that constrains the problem such that there is still some control. But hopefully, not as ridiculous as some of these maps you've shown.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the ways that this is going through my work and through others is kind of computational accountability of gerrymandering. There was recent work out of Illinois where they just simulated hundreds of thousands of plausible maps and then analyzed the current map and saying, is this outcome likely or is this outcome unlikely and therefore evidence of malfeasance? So that's an interesting approach. So in passing laws, one state at a time, there's a kind of unilateral disarmament problem where if a blue state gives up its gerrymander and a red state keeps its gerrymander, then the Congress is distorted. So we kind of need something that can be applied everywhere. And in that kind of strategic vein, I know one person who's advocating computational accountability and court challenges. Because, the ACLU and the League of Women Voters and Common Cause can go into a state that has gerrymandered and sue them to get it ungerrymandered. And, you can apply national lawyering dollars to fix a local problem. And there's a certain logic to that strategy. So, yeah, I think, right. Also, giving up the map pen entirely and letting a computer doing it fully automatically obviously will miss some opportunities that a good person looking at a map would do. Like someone who really understands Massachusetts could draw lines to say, oh, these people go together because reasons of, this is actually a community of interest. These people will actually identify together. But the problem is we have very few of those people actually drawing lines. I believe Iowa has had a pretty good independent commission model for redistricting for several decades, and it's worked pretty well. They also only have 4 Congress people, so there's not a whole lot of wiggle room to play with. But versus Alaska, at last I checked, their state legislature maps have been subject to court challenge every decade since statehood.
Thank you.
Hello again. I had a quick comment about strategic voting because it came up. So I want to mention that for no single member district there's no voting system that completely eliminates strategic voting, even in instant runoff. Because of that situation where who your first choice is matters in terms of whether a candidate who was otherwise widely acceptable can get eliminated in the first round. There is some incentive to strategically vote for who your first choice is, even with instant runoff voting. From what there's analysis I saw which showed ratings or approval voting does have lower less ability to vote strategically, and certainly even instant runoff and voting still is much lower than single member. But I believe from what I read, if you have multi-member districts, that largely gets rid of strategic voting. So I wasn't sure if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, that gets into proportional representation. So if you're electing 5 or more people at once, then you want to vote for who you really want, and you're more likely to get them. Right, because you will be voting as part of some coalition, most likely. You will be voting with the Dems or Greens or Libertarians or Republicans or the Nature Conservancy or the gun lobby. You'll be voting with some group on the issue, and so you will get something, most likely, in a proportional representation scheme. So yeah, I believe that does it's a pressure release valve for the pressure of electing one person. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk and for all the work you're doing. So, I have a point and then a question, or comment and a question, I guess. So my comment is, you mentioned just earlier in response to one of the earlier questions about how people shouldn't try to, like voters shouldn't try to game the system, for instance, like depending on the algorithm being used for ranked choice voting, right? Like vote for what you actually, like your sincere intentions, not some strategized kind of clever hacking of that, right? Of whatever the specific algorithm is. So I guess like the issue that I have in general, having followed politics for a while and been very frustrated with how kind of dysfunctional government and electoral processes are and all that, and the unfairness or bias in the system and the gaming of the system and so on, is that it seems like underneath it all is there's this problem of this kind of very human subjective problem, and at the other end of the spectrum is kind of like objective ways of approaching it, right? Like for instance, I think that you're kind of framing here, right? Just have an algorithm which is kind of blind to these various kind of subjective factors. But then at the end of the day, as you point out, it's like, well, voters and politicians are going to know about the underlying objective system, and they're going to find, if their mindset is kind of diabolical, they're going to find ways of subverting the system, which maybe speaks to, well, some systems are just more difficult to game than others, but humans are very clever, and we're always going to find ways, like if we have kind of bad intentions, right, kind of undermining a system, or getting our result, even if it's not really borne out in the majority of the population, for instance. So it's just a commentary about even with all these objective measures, there's always going to be that desire, if there's kind of bad intentions out there. So which then gets me to thinking about how do we actually kind of minimize the impact of those bad intentions by kind of promoting kind of healthier mindsets toward our self-governance and things like that, which it isn't diametrically opposed to what you're doing. It's actually, there is a relation there. So if you want to speak to that, that'd be great. But also my follow-up question is, have you looked into kind of producing kind of egregious examples of kind of if you turned your algorithm kind of turned it evil, right? Like how bad can you make it to perhaps maybe shine a light on this is how bad the situation. If you wanted to really be strategic about kind of undermining kind of democratic principles and majority government and minority representation, here's how you could do it, and this is how awful and just how distasteful it would be if you were better at trying to gerrymander than you currently are. And might that kind of help people shine a light on how bad it could be, right? So
to answer your second point first, the data that I would want for that would be recent precinct by precinct election data for a general election, a governor, a senator, a president, and then I would map those precinct data back out onto the world and say, okay, how do I cut this up so that I get the most of my party winning and the fewest of the other party winning? And the problem is that data is really hard to come by. It's different state by state. Sometimes it's different county by county. They don't just hand it out except to the parties. Because I was very familiar with the law when I lived in California. The parties just get that data. If you are a major party in California, you get a copy of the address of every registered voter in the state. You've been talking to the elections officials, the county clerk and whatnot, for decades, and you can just show up and say, hey, can I have a data dump from last Tuesday? And they're like, yeah, all right. So, but there is a very small, nascent, distributed network of people trying to gather that data. And they have a handful of states for a handful of years. And it's just hard to come by.
So it's just an issue of just getting enough people kind of aggregating all this data from all the different districts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Back on the first choice around psychology and voting, it is my sincere hope that a better system will open up people to thinking about the system differently. You know right now that if you vote for Nader, he's not going to win. But sometimes you do anyway because you hope it sends a message, or you're just being idealistic or whatever. And I kind of applaud that idealism. I just want to say, okay, but do you have a second choice? And that would improve the outcome. Okay, you really like Trump, but do you have a second choice? What could have happened in the most recent Republican primary if you had it sorted out differently? Because there were 15 different candidates at some point that were considered viable at some level. That could have gone in any which direction. And speaking of could have gone in any which direction, the French presidential election. This year, less so, but back in 2002, they had a very close election. The first round election had people coming in at like 23, 21, 15, 13, 10%. And this is in a pick one ballot. But all those people who voted for the top two, then they had a top two runoff. And the second choice candidate was the elder Monsieur Le Pen, who got like 20% in the first round and 20% in the second round because he was out there and he had his diehard followers and nobody else. And everyone else said, okay, I guess we vote for the boring guy.
I wonder, if that was like the new established system, if given the current hyper partisan, very kind of tribal, divided kind of electorate, even in the primaries, it gets kind of micro tribal, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's it'll just descend. Given that environment, if it would just descend into, okay, in the primaries, vote Trump first, Cruz last, or Hillary first, Bernie last, to kind of make up for that. If you want to recover that kind of tribal kind of,
right? I know
you can do that.
I hope not, and I hope that having these things actually run and looking at actual data will bear out that, yeah, probably a few people will do that, but if you're sending a message, you should send a message of, this is what I really like, this will do, and this is not so bad, this is really bad. Just actually send that message, and if we have a good election algorithm, a good result will come out. But
great, thank you.
Hi. A question about your redistricting algorithm. Why did you choose average distance to the center as the thing to maximize for? Are there other options? What other types of things could you look at?
Sure. There are dozens of proposed measures of what is generally called compactness. The opposite of compactness is the sprawling, tendrils of tentacled monster districts. So there are lots of ways of measuring what a compact district is. A lot of them are purely geometrical. The length of the perimeter around the district, the ratio of the area of the district to the area of the smallest enclosing circle of the district, and these kinds of things. But what these purely geometrical measures don't do is they don't tell you anything about the distribution of the people inside the district. So imagine, if you will, a perfectly circular district. This is perfectly compact. What if it is perfectly circular, but there's a huge city off on one edge, and then rural areas out from it? That is perhaps not the ideal of having a perfectly circular district that is just bullseye on a city, that it's kind of representing that city and metro area. So that's what I wanted to do, is by measuring the distribution of the people, how far away are the people from the center of their district? How tightly packed are the people? So that's what I really wanted to measure in designing my measure. There are still some variations. I'm still looking into other things. One thing I'm doing is I'm measuring the land area of the district and finding the center of the land area and measuring the distance to people. Maybe I should just completely forget about land entirely and measure the population center of the district and measure the distance from people to people. on even numbered days, I believe in one, and on odd numbers the other. But I implemented this one, and I think it's pretty good.
Thanks. I think to some extent you need to consider natural boundaries and transportation and things like that. But that wasn't what I was going to comment about. At the end of your prepared remarks, I think you briefly touched on this. I found it dissatisfying that states with bicameral legislatures have two bodies, each of whose members are allocated based on arbitrary geographic boundaries. And I was wondering why they don't just make one of the bodies at-large seating with preferential balloting or something like that.
Yes, I would love that. I would, for every bicameral legislature, take the smaller one and maybe run it in two off-cycle sessions. Like, if you have a state legislator of 40 people, run it in two with 4-year terms. Run it in 2 sessions, so you're electing 20 people every 2 years at large across the whole state, proportional representation. I would love that. If anyone wants to write up a constitutional amendment for a state, let's do it.
So I had 2 questions. The first was, you had mentioned things about like proportional representation or transferable vote. And the U.S. system, it's traditionally very much region-oriented electoral process.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my first question is, how do you kind of balance these 2 objectives?
Yeah. Basically, in spending 15 years studying districting, the most unexpected thing that I discovered is that people don't actually want districts. They don't actually care about local representation nearly as much as they do about ideological representation. I mean, that is especially true in the current political climate. There are times when having a local representative is still awfully handy, and people will identify with a local representative, which is why in a bicameral system, I would have one of each. I would have a districted local representative and the at-large proportional ideological representative. And, there's a current court case in Wisconsin that I think is sitting with SCOTUS right now that is putting this to the test of, will Wisconsin be required to gerrymander for both parties? Will it be required to achieve proportional representation by district, saying, okay, this state is 60% Republican and 40% Democrat. We should make sure that our state legislature and our US House seats break the same way, even if that means that 49% of people in every district are unhappy. Whereas if you had a proportional system, you're not in a district, and you might still have some representative that you feel affinity for. So yeah, I see people trying to achieve proportionality through districting, and I find that to be a terribly awkward fit. And I think what they actually want is a more direct proportional system if we could just figure out a way to broach the subject and start down that reform path.
All right. The second question I had is a little bit orthogonal to the talk, but there's it used to be that the Senate in the U.S. was elected, representatives were elected by state legislatures rather than directly to the people, from the people. And this, I think, was viewed as a mechanism to kind of squash, short-term passions. My question is what do you think about these kind of tiered voting systems?
There is definitely a rationale for a hierarchical system where each layer elects the layer above it. You get network effects. Every layer has its own, what's that guy, the number, 150. So if there's only so many, relationships that you can carry on as a human, then every layer, kind of mimics that star topology. And I think that can make sense. Direct democracy has its place. Right? So let's take the president. Right now we have a fake direct election. And every 4 years this frustrates me, and I wish we had either a real direct election with an actual national popular vote, or we would quit faking it and just let the state legislature decide, and we would have more of a parliamentary system. And we have this one national vote that can get thrown out sometimes. What's up with that? So, I think we should either have real hierarchical systems or real direct systems, and there's a place for each. Yeah.
Thanks.
On your redistricting algorithm, you talked a lot about compactness. Was there anything about trying to keep the districts of near equal population?
Oh yeah, they are all with equal population to within 0.5%.
Cool.
Current maps sometimes get it down to exactly one person, and they are doing funny business to achieve that, so I didn't bother keeping myself to that strategy. So I'm just keeping it to within 0.5% variance between districts.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. The traditional requirements of districts are equal population and contiguous. So, and that's it. And at various court decisions, they refuse to put any other law restrictions on it, and therefore the state legislature does whatever partisan hackery they want.
Hi, there's recently some news coverage about research into a partisan efficiency gap.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been following that, and do you have hope that that might help swing districting away from gerrymandering?
So yeah, this came up again about the recent Wisconsin case, and it is following that line of logic, I believe, leads to shoddy proportionality through districting, where we say, we will make the districts such that this 60-40 state turns out with 60-40 end representatives, which in some ways would be an improvement over the current system where you have, a 48-52% state that winds up being a 60-40 representation, because of gerrymandering really pushing it that extra gap. So in the kind of balance of power way, it's better, but in terms of actually representing people, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
This is a little bit of an out there question, but in terms of have you looked at using your redistricting algorithm or a redistricting algorithm for things other than districts, like the states or the Balkans or other places that have somewhat arbitrary lines, and what does that look like?
It is right. It's on my to-do list of like, well, what if we redistricted the Senate? Because the U.S. Senate is nonsensical in its current implementation. I believe it made sense in 1790 when the states had an option of being actually independent mini nationalities. Like, we could have Rhode Island hanging out with Luxembourg, and they'd be on equal footing. But I don't think it makes sense anymore. I think I would love to see the U.S. Senate replaced with an at-large proportional body with 33 people elected every 2 years. That would be really interesting to have a national Senate election. The same as, but we should probably try it on a state level first because the states are the laboratories of democracy.
Thanks.
In your packing and cracking slides, you showed how to push a 60-40 populace to one end or the other. Do you have measurements on how your system approximates representational voting in all the states and other algorithms as well?
That goes back to I would need to get the partisan election data in order to do that kind of modeling. So I have the census is built in racial demographics for my districts. So I can tell you, yes, I make 2 majority black districts in Georgia. But as for party breakdown, no, I don't have that data.
So another ramification of gerrymandering, by creating safe seats, you end up getting more radical or extreme people elected than reflects the population as a whole, as we've seen. So while getting closer to proportionality through districting may seem unsatisfactory at some level, it would also have the effect of a different population of elected representatives, a much more representative and moderate one. So that seems like a highly desirable outcome. And then I think coupled with probably the most pragmatic solution to these gerrymandering problems is the judicial solution, and the fact that big data does allow us to actually score these gerrymandered districts now, and to impose requirements that districting schemes do obey some computational fairness, which not only gets us closer, yes, less perfectly satisfactory, but closer to representational, and therefore more representative elected representatives. That seems like a sort of double goodness. How does that strike you?
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely have a problem of safe seats. I worked a campaign when I lived in California. I was briefly the volunteer webmaster for a congressional campaign for a few months. Let me say that again. I was the volunteer webmaster for a congressional campaign because they were running in a district that was gerrymandered against them. For many years, California had a bipartisan gerrymander where everybody on both sides had a safe seat. And so our party did not send any help. They figured we were a lost cause. And their candidate would not even agree to show up for any debates. They did not deign to partake in the democratic process because they didn't have to. They had a safe seat. And there are lots of sociological analyses to be done and saying, oh, well, all of these safe seat politicians are now more extremist because some of them have had primary challenges from the extreme wing of their party, and those are the motivated people who actually get out during a primary. So we're representing 2% of the people. 2% of the people show up, vote in a primary, and that's who wins.
Yes, you mentioned that hierarchical voting schemes and the direct democracy each had their place. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about which places are more appropriate for which method.
Well, maybe this is part of the checks and balances system of our government. We have a state legislature that is elected from pretty small local districts. In Massachusetts, some of our districts are 30,000 something people. And then we also have a governor who is voted on by everyone. So you have that play right there of you have the direct democracy of everyone votes and gets one representative for everyone, and everyone votes and gets their local representative who work together in the milieu of the state house to do their thing. I don't think we would ever be happy with a fully hierarchical system because, we would then lose touch with people a few levels up, and we would see them doing things and we would say, they don't represent us. So
what you're saying is you want to mix. It's
yes.
Not that for these things you want this kind, and for these things you want
yes.
that kind. You want some of each.
Yes.